as any company gets bigger, and certainly when you make the move to public, your risk tolerance just has to go down. So you can accept less risk when you're an early stage company and you've got 3 big VC shareholders who know exactly the risk that they signed up for, and they want you to go at it and swing for the fences. And so as a GC, you've got to be able to calibrate. And I think some GCs just sort of naturally run much more conservative and some run much more, risk taking. And I think the biggest thing is like, there's not a right or a wrong answer. It's really just what is satisfactory and exciting to you as a person.
How can you pursue a path of professional growth at a company over the course of a decade? What's required to take on wide-ranging responsibilities for a business? And how can C-suite leaders navigate challenging political issues that affect their companies? Today, we are incredibly lucky to be joined on the abstract by my friend, Kristin Sverchek, president of Lyft, which I would describe as the friendly ride-sharing company. She's got fun graphic in the background, and she's wearing a fun shirt. Before taking on the president role, Kristin was the president of business affairs, and before that, she was Lyft's first general counsel. She helped lead Lyft's IPO, which raised about $2.33 billion in the public markets. And before joining Lyft, she was a partner at Silicon Legal Strategy, as well as starting her career at Gunderson, a law firm that I think a number of our listeners have either worked with or worked for. Kristin, thanks so much for joining me today for this episode of The Abstract.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
We are going to start outside of the law today. You actually studied molecular and cell biology at Berkeley. I think that's a fun fact. I don't think many people know that about you.
I love dropping that fact.
Yeah. You have a built-in fun fact to go along with your name and where you're from and where you've worked for life. What did you think that you were going to be at that point?
It's a great 2 truths and a lie fact, by the way. I was always interested in the sciences. I grew up in Livermore, a town that famously has Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My parents were both scientists. Yeah. And so that just felt honestly like a natural course of action for me. And by the way, my brother's a chemical engineer, so it's deep within our family's DNA. But I did a few summers working at Lawrence Livermore and as a research scientist during college. And even though it was fascinating, I knew that I didn't want to be doing that for, the next 40, 50, 60 years. By the time that I reached my senior year of college, I was pretty sure that I was not going to pursue a career in science.
And, you end up becoming a lawyer. Tell us a little bit about that decision. Like what led you to decide to want to go to law school and pursue a different path?
Well, I was famously argumentative growing up. So my parents had told me many times I would make a great attorney. And so as I kind of came to this realization that biology was not going to be a forever career for me, I thought, okay, law school feels like a good next step. And I would actually say that looking back upon reflection, the skills that you learn studying science, the logical thinking, the detail orientation, the attacking a problem from every angle, they're super translatable to the legal field. So while it feels like a disparate kind of career path, for me, it actually felt, like a really natural step.
Interesting. Tell us about how you found your way to Lyft. When I think about your story, when I think about Lyft's story, the sort of growth that you've experienced over your professional career and Lyft really sort of growing up, like these are very tied together in my mind. So tell us about how you found Lyft and what was the company like when you first joined?
Yeah, so in June of 2010, I was working at Silicon Legal Strategy. I was representing actually Floodgate Fund, who were the investors in the Series seed round of funding for a company called Zimride, which was a long distance online carpool platform, basically like a SaaS product. The company would sell these subscriptions to colleges and universities. So I was investors counsel for this round of private financing. After that deal closed, this, teeny 5-person company, the co-founders, John and Logan, were like, hey, you were a great lawyer, across the table. Do you want to be our outside counsel? And I said, sure. And so I was their outside counsel for a couple of years. And in early 2012, we were in a board meeting. I was, there as in my stead as outside counsel. And they started talking about this on-demand mobile app sort of version of the Zimride service. And this, of course, will later become Lyft. But it was the earliest stages of this idea where all the investors who were board members sitting around the table, sort of swiveled their heads at me and said, like, is that legal? And, my answer to them was that regulations had not been written contemplating this, right? Like and this was, San Francisco, so California specifically, the California Public Utilities Code written 100 years ago certainly could not have foreseen the ways in which a mobile app could connect to people. And so basically, our premise at that time was, well, we're going to have to change some law to make sure that we have, a safe harbor of sorts, but we're not doing anything that's strictly illegal. And so, I continued working with the company as outside counsel, but the calls started coming every day. And ultimately, in the fall of 2012, they asked me to join them full-time as the company's first general counsel. I told them no, because I had a job that I liked. I liked working with a bunch of different small startups, but they were super persistent. And ultimately, of course, I ended up saying yes. And so that's how I found my way to Lyft in the fall of 2012.
It's a great story. This was your first GC role, right? Outside counsel. I'm sure you served as a quasi outside GC to a variety of companies before, but it's different being, in the seat yourself. Talk to us a little bit about the learning curve in the early days. And then, of course, I've got a bunch of follow-ups on sort of like as you build out a big team, as Lyft really takes off.
The learning curve was very steep. And I was not prepared for that at all, because since I'd been working with this company as outside counsel, and I'd known them for a few years at this point, and I'd worked with a number of the employees, because, I'd helped them do all these deals, I thought like it was just basically going to be showing up to work at a different office, when I switched from Silicon Legal Strategy to Lyft. And I really didn't know, and thankfully I later learned, that the role of GC is a fundamentally different job than the role of outside counsel. And I just, that was news to me, right? And so, what I realized is that when you're outside counsel, the relationship is much more of a push relationship. Someone comes to you, they decide to come to you. And so they're asking for your advice, and you are already being sort of asked to give it to them. Whereas when you're in-house counsel, sometimes people are asking for your advice, sometimes they're not, but you got to give it. So you really have to work on building those relationships and building that trust. And Lyft had a culture, which I'm super thankful for, but a culture of people challenging each other. And so there was not a strong hierarchy in terms of like, oh, I'm the lawyer, so I get to tell you what to do. No. It was like the most junior person in the room could say, Kristin, I don't understand that advice. Like, why does that make sense? And, there were moments really early on where I realized, oh, they're right and I'm wrong. And and so it was humbling, but it was also really fun and exciting.
As the company grows, talk to us about building the team. Like, how did you bring in the right sort of talent? How did you grow as a manager? I'd imagine that's one of the sort of steepest curves as Lyft sped towards, no pun intended, an IPO. That was not in the script.
Sped toward, but always within the speed limit, of course.
Yes.
When I joined, I was relatively junior in my career. My experience was all in the corporate transaction space. And I was joining a company that obviously was like heavily immersed in a sort of like a legal and regulatorily tricky area from day one. And so even before I accepted the job, I was very clear to to let the co-founders know that I'd be requiring budget for outside counsel to complement my own skill set because I knew that I didn't know it all. And that was the sort of same philosophy I had as I went to build out the legal team. I really looked for people with skills that were different from my own. So, some of the first people I hired both had litigation backgrounds. Another early hire had an employment background. At the time, insurance, still today, insurance is very big for us, but at the time it was within my purview. And so I, hired someone with insurance expertise. And it was only like 5 or 6 hires down the road that I ultimately hired, another corporate person to effectively sort of duplicate myself such that I could be in more of a leadership role versus a practitioner role. And, I looked for people who were diverse, and I looked for people who were better than me at their jobs. And I did that, knowing full well that like some people might be threatened by bringing in a cohort of folks who were, really, really good experts in their fields. But for me, like this was the ticket to success. And I was very right to bet in that way because all of these people that I'm talking about, very quickly gained the trust of the co-founders and other management because they were so good at what they did. And many of them, some of them are still at Lyft today, by the way. And a decade later, and others of them that have since gone on, stayed a long time and have gone on to really amazing things.
I'm curious about the IPO. I think we should talk about that a little bit. A first sort of question to you is, was that inevitable and did it feel inevitable and what was your role in that process? And then I'm also really interested in how your role changed. How you felt your role changed. And we can talk about, what it's like to be a public company GC and how that's different than a privately held business. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess one thing I will say about management before I move on, just because it's in my head is, I spoke about how the culture at Lyft was one of individuals respectfully challenging one another. This was very true on the legal team too. So in terms of how did I learn to become an effective manager, it's because people told me when I was doing things wrong. And that was not just, substantive legal stuff. That was also personnel management. And they held me to account. And I am so grateful for that because that is how I developed as a manager. And so just, I guess, a certain, like a piece of advice is like, this is the way that leaders should act. And for me, I sort of had no choice because I knew that I didn't know a lot. But as I become later in my career, I am really intentional in trying to remember that I can still learn from others all of the time.
Of course.
So going public, it definitely was not sort of, preordained that Lyft would go public. I mean, certainly when I first joined the company, and by the way, it was 30 people, Series B, operational in San Francisco only. I didn't even know if the company was going to succeed, let alone even if it did succeed, maybe it would be acquired in like a year or two for some tiny fraction. And so I don't think I could have. And also when I joined in 2012, like the IPO markets were not hot. And so there was a long period of time with like very little in the way of tech IPO activity. And so I actually think an IPO was like the furthest thing from my mind when I joined the company. And in fact, if I had known that part of the job would be taking the company public, I might have been more scared to say yes because my background was really in private company work. And I didn't necessarily feel that I had the appropriate background and skill set for public company work. But the beauty of my job is that, I started in 2012. We took the company public in 2019. So I had 7 years of step-by-step learning, gradual, organic growth versus 0 to 60. And so I also think like it's easy for people to forget that, I didn't just become a public company GC overnight. The company grew with me. I grew with the company. And so if we had gone out in 2015, gosh, that would have been scary. But by the time it was 2019 or 2018, when we were really preparing in earnest, I was ready, and we'd gotten more mature in our processes. The team had been built out, both on the legal side, but also on the finance side, accounting side, the other partner teams that are super important for legal to have in a public company. And so we were a fairly well-oiled machine by then. And so from being private to public in that moment, it did feel more like a stepwise change. A small step, not a major step. And I am so thankful for having had that long runway to prepare, because I can't imagine what it would have been like to do it immediately. But I also leaned on my outside counsel then too. So, you always have to have experts around you.
And it was a startup, and I've worked for various startups. I feel like a year in a startup environment is like dog years, right? So 7 years in a company like Lyft is very different than 7 years at a company like PepsiCo,
100%.
let's say.
100% agree. Yes. Sometimes it feels like I've worked here for 40 years. So. Yeah.
Looking at sort of your life before the IPO and after the IPO, I talked to public company GCs, I talked to private company GCs. What are your thoughts on how those day-to-days look different? And I think you really thrived in a public company environment, but who's that right for? Because I don't necessarily think public company life is right for everyone.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I think the biggest change is that demand of the quarterly calendar. And it is still shocking to me, 5.5 years post public offering, how fast those quarter ends come around. And so you really are sort of owned by that annual calendar, and everything is, you're sort of working backwards, planning from earnings every quarter. And that is a big part of the role for a public company GC or a public company CFO. And so then everything else you do, people management, the performance cycle, compensation planning, annual planning, all has to fit within that calendar. And sometimes those things layer on top of each other. I mean, a great example, in May of this year, so when we were reporting our Q1 earnings, we had earnings. We also had a trial with the Massachusetts Attorney General. And so you had the legal team, flat out like a dozen people on one thing, a dozen people on another. And you really try to plan to avoid stuff like that. It's not always possible, but it can be really difficult. Whereas private company, I think there is a huge urgency to everything, but you don't have these drop dead, super fixed deadlines like that. And I also think the other major difference, and this is a sort of a sliding scale, is as any company gets bigger, and certainly when you make the move to public, your risk tolerance just has to go down. You can accept less risk, when your shareholders are out there in the public market than you can when you're an early stage company and you've got 3 big VC shareholders who know exactly the risk that they signed up for, and they want you to go at it and swing for the fences. And so as a GC, you've got to be able to calibrate. And I think some GCs just sort of naturally run much more conservative, and some run much more, risk taking. And I think the biggest thing is there's not a right or a wrong answer. It's really just what is satisfactory and exciting to you as a person.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the challenges of being an executive, right? Like having to lead. We talk about the IPO, the market's changing, making that possible. But the success of Lyft, as a business model, from a regulatory perspective, from the competitors that were in the market, right? It was not inevitable. There were a lot of folks who probably doubted the vision, and also may have doubted specific decisions that you and other executives made. How did you handle that sort of questioning? How did you get tougher over time?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say there were so many of those moments, more than I can possibly count. And, the major ones, I think, were a lot of the ones you mentioned, being severely underfunded relative to our largest competitor, and, having COVID happen and sort of the bottom drop out with respect to all of a sudden people weren't taking rides in a way that was really unpredictable. But But there were so many other moments, in between. And I guess a couple things I would say. One is, this is an important thing to think about when you're hiring. You want to make sure you hire the person who has grit and resilience of their own. And we had some of those people who just really, they couldn't take that kind of stress. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just those people left and they went for a job that was more stable. But the people who were here and really wanted to fight through are the people who are amazing. They're amazing. Like, they really have that. It's that internal motivation of knowing that perseverance through a tough job and completing it in a really great way is like, that is its own reward. And so the way that I tried to motivate as a leader was talking to people about that. And even in the really negative times, frankly, I also talked to people about the fact that that was good experience too. No, it's not fun. Yes, we all love the up and to the right times. But as a professional, you're not well-rounded if you've only seen good times and not bad times. And so for me, sometimes some of the motivator was, I really want to know, I want to learn how to lead through all situations.
Yeah. Were there ways that you tried to manage the stress? I mean, it's one thing to have, say, a fidelity or questioning the vision of the business or analysts, right? That's one piece. Another piece is, you as an executive personally make a tough call and you have a bunch of employees who are or contractors or whoever they're dissatisfied with that. That's very different. It's much more personal. Yeah. Talk to us a little about that.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest way I know how to lead is through transparency. And so I think that as a leader, it's important to show your work. And what I mean by that is, take your team members along on the journey that you went through in making a certain decision or deciding on a certain course of action, and acknowledge that there might be some imperfections in your logic or some things that you can't quite square. But ultimately, people want to understand your methodology, and they want to understand, did you think about X, Y, and Z possible pitfall? And I think usually people are okay with an imperfect decision if they understand why you made it. But people really don't like it when you just give them the headline with none of the news underneath. And so for me, I think that was the best way to do it. And people got to know me. I also, by the way, and this has been sort of less true in recent years, but for many, many years, spent tons of one-on-one time with people, just talking to them so they could understand the ways in which I thought about things and where I agreed with leadership, where I didn't agree with leadership. And so, that's one of the biggest things that I've talked to people about through the years is how I go about making a judgment or advising in a particular situation. It's not the decision, it's everything behind the decision that matters.
Your role over time also evolved quite considerably within the business. And I think this is one of the most interesting things that's happening in sort of executive leadership right now. You're seeing this at companies like Microsoft or with, Brad Smith or Kent Walker at Google or others. Maybe Sheryl Sandberg sort of played a similar-ish role for many years. You transitioned to become president of business affairs. Let's talk about that first.
Yeah.
Was that something that you wanted to create? Did your CEO come to you and say, Kristin, we're going to create this for you? What did that look like?
Yeah. So what it looked like was in 2021, I was coming back from maternity leave, having had my third child at Lyft. Yes, thank goodness for that maternity leave policy. And
which I'm sure you have played a role in crafting.
I absolutely did. And I will proudly take a lot of credit for that. But I will say it's been, all of the leaders here have modeled it as well by taking it. So that's the kind of thing that's only meaningful if everybody utilizes it.
Sure.
But so I came back from that maternity leave and I was talking to one of our board members, and that board member said something to me like, you've been here 9 years at this point. You're a great leader. You have created a following within the company. You have retained so many folks. You have trained them up. you need to do a little more here. And I'm not going to get that for you. You need to go get it for yourself. So I went and talked to our co-founders, and I sort of pitched them on this idea about like, I could take on more of the behind the scenes type stuff. And, at the time I owned legal, but I pitched them on policy and a few other things. And, to my, I wouldn't say like overwhelming surprise, but slight surprise, the answer was just immediately yes. They were like, you want more, we're happy to give it to you. So, I'd been prepared to really like advocate for myself, and it was actually much more simple than that. And so the role in its earliest stage ended up being legal, policy, people, the chief information officer, and business development and global supply chain. So we went from an org of about 170 people to an org that was about 10x that size, really overnight. So it was a major, major change. But the good news was that, all of these teams that I sort of folded in together in the business affairs org, these were all leaders that I knew and had worked with really well for many years.
Did that feel like a risk at the time, going and asking for that? I mean, if the answer is no, I don't know. That might change your trajectory.
I'm a big believer in the worst someone can do is say no to you. So I am a big believer in asking the question. All of that said, like, I wouldn't push someone to ask that question after 3 months on the job with no reputational currency and no, proof points as far as to why they could make such a request. But, at this point in time, again, I'm 9 years into the role, 2 years past taking the company public. I've handled all sorts of thorny situations and had this really long-standing relationship of trust. And so I knew that if the co-founder said no, I wasn't going to be in a worse position, maybe a little ego bruise, but but it wouldn't be damaging sort of to my career prospects at the company in any way.
The Abstract is brought to you by SpotDraft, an end-to-end contract lifecycle management system that helps high-performing legal teams become 10 times more efficient. If you spend hours every week drafting and reviewing contracts, worrying about being blindsided by renewals, or if you just want to streamline your contracting processes, SpotDraft is the right solution for you. From creating and managing templates and workflows, to tracking approvals, e-signing, and reporting via an AI-powered repository, SpotDraft helps you in every stage of your contracting. And because it should work where you work, it integrates with all the tools your business already uses. SpotDraft is the key that unlocks the potential of your legal team. Make your contracting easier today at SpotDraft.com.
Going from 150, 170 folks to more than 1,000, that's a big change. That probably also changes your day-to-day a lot, right? Like how much you have to delegate and how much you're managing through various sort of meetings. Did you get coached through that process? How did you make that transition? Because that's huge. That's going from like at least quasi hands-on to sort of like managing through an org.
Yeah, I have had executive coaching at many points during my career, and that was certainly one of them. And I think like, as with sort of the early days of leading the legal team, one of the big things I did then was make sure that the leaders could speak for themselves about what role they needed me to play. And so I made sure that they had their own autonomy as far as, they were still leading their own org-wide meetings. And the person who was promoted into the GC role to backfill me, she was now leading the legal team meetings. I wasn't, but I would drop in whenever it was helpful as far as, if there was a rough time and they felt like, the team needed to hear from another executive voice. And I would bring the collective organization together on a quarterly basis to talk about issues of common interest, which frankly, there were many, because those orgs, we sort of created this like, it was a massive Venn diagram, but it showed like the various overlap between the different teams. And there was quite a bit of things that touched 2 to 3 teams at once. And like I said, these were all seasoned leaders who deeply knew what they and their teams needed for success. And that was the role that I tried to play.
I see more and more. I mean, I mentioned some sort of like big figures in the public discourse, and I think your role is a little bigger than like a typical GC plus role. But you're seeing more and more of these GC plus roles, which are GC plus head of people or GC who also owns all the facilities and IT and InfoSec, et cetera. Do you have advice for people who aspire to maybe first grow their remit or maybe even grow into something bigger like the roles that you've had or a COO role?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I think one is make sure you can take your legal hat off, because that can be really hard to do. Like the policy team here, for example, it makes fun of me because sometimes when I'm talking to them, I even today will say things like, okay, I have to, here's how this is, I'm hearing this from a legal perspective, but let me take my legal hat off and then weigh in. Because you're gonna lose your credibility as a leader of, X other org if you are only talking to them as a lawyer. You have to remember that is no longer your job, or it is not your job in that particular instance. And so I often do say that sort of explicitly, because I got to remind myself too, even after, several years of sort of being in that plus role. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing is, you need to have the trust and confidence of the CEO or COO, or, whoever else is sort of, maybe it might be even the CFO, whoever else is calling the shots in the organization. Because if they can only take you seriously as the GC, then you're not going to succeed as the head of people. And so I think it's like a combination of those two things. And then I guess with the third being a theme that we've touched on a few times already, which is know what you don't know and be willing to learn from the experts around you. So if you're newly taking on a head of HR role, you better hope you have like a really great number two who maybe is a more seasoned HR professional and is willing to work with you. And maybe they themselves are not ready to be in the leadership role for whatever reason, but maybe you can sort of help them with respect to leadership, and they can help you with respect to the substantive knowledge or management or whatever it is. But, I'm definitely a big fan of like coming into a new role with a really good degree of humility.
I'm going to ask you in a minute about the sort of transition to the broader president role. But, as soon as you made that leap to president of business affairs, or I think around that time, I think of one of the big initiatives as being Lyft's willingness to take a position on certain political issues, right? Yeah. I've always sort of thought about Lyft as having great friendly branding. Obviously, there were the sort of regulatory battles around, how are drivers classified, et cetera. But it became much broader than in the sort of public discourse, like we might see you on CNBC. I guess my question is, how did that come about? Did that come about organically? And how do you think about companies sort of living out their values? How do companies define their values to take positions on issues like, say, a law around abortions in Texas?
Yeah. So for us, because we did start as an organization that always had to be pretty engaged in the political sphere, given the fact that, we had to go out and make new laws really from day one, we had to quickly define our values as they related to the external policy landscape and how we thought about things. And so we had taken political stands, even before I stepped into that business affairs role. So, one example is in 2017, I think, when we spoke out against the Muslim ban and donated, I think, $1 million to the ACLU at that point in time. And the reason that we did that in that case was because many of our drivers are Muslim Americans and immigrants. And so a ban like that deeply affects one of our super important stakeholders. And similarly, in 2021, 2021, when we took a stand on Texas's SB 8, and I was very proud to be the face of that, it was because that law was and is so unique in that it provides for this private right of action for individuals to sue one another to the extent that the person they're suing has either gotten abortion care or aided someone else in getting abortion care. And so we were hearing from our drivers that they were really worried about being personally liable to the extent that they drove somebody to a Planned Parenthood. And this was like an untenable situation for our drivers. And, certainly it's a horrible law. I'll go on record as saying that. But we felt that we really had to act because we did not feel okay with our drivers feeling that they were in personal financial jeopardy just by availing themselves of the flexible earnings opportunities that Lyft drivers are always able to avail themselves of. And so we took a really bold stand there too. But again, it was because of this nexus to our driver population. And so certainly you can't, as a company, be taking a stand on every issue under the sun because there are so many, and there are so many important ones. You have to decide, I think, really what is core to you. And so you won't see us at Lyft taking a stand everywhere, but I think, you will see us being really thoughtful when it relates to the populations that really matter to our business, and drivers being one of those.
Yeah, it's not a unique idea that I've had. It's others, Edelman or Axios, or this idea that CEOs are now often called upon to sort of be politicians to a certain extent, right? Actually, trust in a lot of businesses is higher than trust in other institutions, which is a big problem.
Yeah, yes.
Unfortunately. But this is sort of I think a requirement of operating as a company in the modern world. I'm sure not all employees agree every time with an executive team's decision to make a call to take a position or to not sometimes take a position. Like, this is not something that we're going to comment on publicly. How have you sort of dealt with that and helped guide the company? You talked about transparency. Maybe that's a big piece, but how do you deal with that piece too?
Yeah, look, we try to know our team members and our customers to the best we possibly can, right? So we understand what people think and feel about things. And so we try to calibrate ourselves to our stakeholders as much as we can. But yes, there were certainly some internal and external stakeholders who were unhappy with that decision around Texas SB 8. There were many more that were happy. And ultimately, we felt that this was so core to this population, particularly in Texas, that it was right. But I think what's most important is not that you achieve 100% consensus, but that you understand, who you're reaching and what sort of all angles of the problem. So, what the people who are not happy are going to say and what the people who are happy are going to say. And so you're making as much of an informed decision as you possibly can. And I think we did that pretty well. And, ultimately from a business perspective, we certainly didn't see any lingering negative impact.
You became president of Lyft about a year ago. I'm curious what changed in your day-to-day when that happened. How did that role come about?
Yeah, so we had in, I think, March or April of 2023, we announced that our co-founders were transitioning in, and one of our board members, transitioning out, and one of our board members would be transitioning in as our new CEO, David Risher. And part of my job has been really to help him with that bridge between old to new. And then part of that job has also been to help him reach folks that, he just doesn't have time to reach. And so I still have a lot of those core areas of responsibility that I spoke about earlier, policy and legal, and we now call it our partners organization, which is like business development, but sort of bigger than it used to be. And but then I've also done a bunch of just what was called for in a given moment, which included leading the comms and marketing teams twice over the past year, transitioning the people team over to David. I did a lot of the media on our Women Plus Connect product, which matches or allows riders and drivers to express a preference to be matched with one another, women and non-binary folks. And so So it's been, a lot of the same role, but a lot of new stuff as well. I've been participating on the earnings calls. So speaking of that, public company calendar that comes around, and that's really been just an incredible sort of added growth experience, like another step up from that president of business affairs role.
Do you even think of yourself as a lawyer anymore? Do you think of yourself as a quasi-lawyer?
Quasi-lawyer is probably the right word. In my heart, I'm still a lawyer, right? But I do like that I think life is about continuing to grow and learn. And that's not to say I couldn't continue to grow and learn in a purely legal role. Of course I could. There's so much more law to learn that I haven't come across. But for me here at Lyft, it was nice to be able to expand into different things. And, been joking with the marketing team, for example, the first time I led that team, I really had to get to know the lingo and just even having been around it, hadn't been deep in the funnel and thinking about, user acquisition. And, now having done 2 stints leading the team, I've just thought so much more deeply about it. And so yeah, the lawyer's always in there somewhere, but there's a bunch of other stuff in there too.
That's great. As we record this, and a lot of security filings have already been done and such, we should say you're actually planning to depart Lyft in a few weeks, and we'll be releasing this episode soon after you more sort of personally announce that to friends and colleagues and peers. Congratulations on a great run. My first question there is how do you prepare a company for a transition like that? Because, as you've alluded to, you have a lot of institutional knowledge about this business and this company, even more than your great ability to execute on things on a day-to-day basis.
It's been hard. It's been really hard. And first, I guess I should say thank you. And it's honestly, it's very bittersweet because I love this place. I love these people and I love this business. But I'm also very tired. And, 12 years is a long time anywhere, let alone in the dog years that you and I spoke about earlier. And so I'm ready for a bit of a break. So no, I don't have any new job to announce. My
well deserved.
Yeah, I'm going to be hanging out with my husband and kids. But the preparations took a long time, and is the honest truth. It's several months, and in some ways, it's been an even longer term journey of being able to make myself redundant and duplicate a lot of the institutional knowledge. In the early days, I think I was a much more pivotal part of Lyft because so much of it was in my head and nowhere else. And, through the maturation of the company and the maturation of the other leaders, now we have systems in place and, people are in the machine themselves doing the things. And so it's really a great time to be leaving because I can leave without a lot of guilt, feeling like people are in great shape and I think they'll miss me, but they're not in any trouble with me going. And that is such a nice feeling to have.
Leaving a company is always tough. I'm sure the conversation with the CEO, maybe it was expected, but it's important to at least, I think, really try, especially in a position that you're in, to leave with a lot of grace too.
100%.
And it sounds like you've managed that very well, unsurprisingly.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there were times in the past when I thought about leaving, but I never wanted to leave in a moment of crisis because I did feel like the organization could not withstand that. And we are happily not in one of those moments as I sit here today. And so that feels good. I never wanted the feeling of, the ship that's sinking and people are jumping off and I'm one of them, because that is not what leaders do. I would be the last one on the ship. And right now the ship is in calm waters and that is great.
As you reflect on your tenure at Lyft, 12 years or so, what are you most proud of having accomplished?
It's so hard to pick one thing. I'm proud of myself for taking a chance on myself all those years ago, even when, it was a big leap of faith to join this teeny tiny little company doing this thing that needed to still be made legal. And I think from like a team and company wide perspective, I would say the IPO, and not because of the reason that I think people think about, which is like, oh, the company's getting a bunch of money and you're famous now. It was because that was a moment when, and, as GC at the time, nearly every person on the legal team worked on that IPO. Obviously, the corporate team was the one, reading every word and every period and comma. But we had all of our litigators and, privacy team and everybody else involved in the zillions of diligence calls we had to do. And so in some ways, like that morning ringing the bell, it felt like the external validation and culmination of so much hard collaborative work by the legal team to put this S1 out into the world. And so much of the work that the team does is, behind closed doors. And so it just was so wonderful to get to see the team have the recognition they deserved. And one of my team members called it like the Super Bowl for lawyers. And that's how I always think about it.
That's fantastic. Last question before a few sort of fun ones that I like to ask guests. And that's, you're going to take some time off. Any idea what's next for you?
I am joining my daughter's school board. I may join a public company board or two, but it really, really taking some time off. And then, looking out to the future, I'm not sure. I like to keep an open mind. I've been very deep in the Lyft ride-sharing world, and I'm excited to pick my head up and look around. So I guess, stay tuned is really like, it'll be a far in the future decision. So I don't know.
That's good. Enjoy the fall, winter, maybe the spring and more. And hopefully you can, read some good books and relax a little bit after a long run. A few fun questions for you as we start to wrap up. The first one, which may change very soon, what's your favorite part of your day-to-day or your daily routine?
Well, for sure, my morning coffee, and you've seen me drinking my fills all through this interview. I will not be able to get my fills anymore, not coming into the Lyft office. But my husband, thankfully, is a great coffee maker himself. And so I will enjoy my coffee at home in a leisurely fashion in the future.
Fantastic. Do you have a professional pet peeve? I think this is kind of a funny one.
Gosh, I mean, so many. No, you know what? A big professional and personal pet peeve is lateness. I cannot stand when people are late. I find it extraordinarily insensitive. And there's, of course, those moments when, everybody has their late moments and there's nothing they can do to control it. So if it's, 1% of the time, I'm cool with it, but I'm not cool with it when it's 99% of the time.
This is a commonality. I was doing another podcast interview before this with the GC turned founder CEO, and his professional pet peeve was the exact same thing. So you're in good company and he's in good company too.
I was going to say, we will meet on time then.
Yes. I am a big reader. Maybe you haven't read a lot of books recently, but hopefully you will soon. So anything that you've read or that's on your list that you would like to recommend to our audience?
I am also a big reader, actually. That is like one of the things I do to unwind is I read every night a little bit before I go to bed. Sometimes it's only 5 pages because I'm so tired, but I do try and read every night. And this summer I've done a little more traveling, so I've had more time to read. And I just finished a brand new novel called Long Island Compromise, and it was excellent. So I would recommend that without reservations. But I can send you a whole list of books.
We'll put them in the show notes.
Okay, good.
We can do a whole LinkedIn post on book recs from Kristin.
I would love that. Well, I should say I actually also co-chair a book club with some parents at my daughter's school. So that is like one of the hobbies that I have kept up even with my job because it just keeps me sane.
I think that's really great. Last question for you, Kristin. It's if you could look back on your days as a young lawyer, sort of just getting started, maybe right out of law school or at the firm, something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then.
I think what I wish I had known is that imposter syndrome can actually be a gift, not something that harms you. And what I mean by that is that there were moments when I spent extra time, obsessing and preparing and combing through things. And that imposter syndrome, that fear really drove me to be the best that I could be. I wish that we need to rebrand imposter syndrome, I think, with a positive spin, because ultimately what it ended up being for me was that drive to really excel and do well and put my best self forward. And that actually helped me tremendously. And so I wish I had that positive framing versus the negative frame of, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't belong here.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Thank you so much for this interview, Kristin, and congratulations.
Thank you.
On a fantastic tenure at Lyft and everything that's going to come.
Thank you so much. It was really great chatting with you.
And to all of our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of The Abstract, and we hope to see you next time.